You know, when we think about how a war ends, we usually picture something dramatic, right? A big surrender ceremony on a battleship, ticker tape parades. But the truth? The real end often happens in a quiet room, around a negotiating table. And that fight, the fight for the peace, can be just as brutal as any battle.
All right, so let's jump right in with that first question. What is the real breaking point in a war? We have this image in our heads, probably from the movies, of a single, decisive blow that leads to a clean victory. And then, boom, peace. But honestly, that's more Hollywood than history. The journey from all-out conflict to a ceasefire is, well, it's messy. It's a battle fought not just with cannons, but with diplomacy, with sheer exhaustion, and a ton of political pressure. The end of the fighting is really just the beginning of the end.
And what's wild is that each war was pushed towards peace by a completely different trigger. For the American Revolution, it was that classic military disaster. The British surrender at Yorktown finally convinced Parliament that the war was just unwinnable. But for the War of 1812, the reason was totally external. Napoleon's defeat in Europe meant Britain's reasons for fighting America, like blocking their trade with France, were suddenly just gone, obsolete. And then you have Korea, where a bloody, brutal stalemate on the ground meant that talking was pretty much the only path forward for everybody.
So once everyone's at the table, a whole new kind of battle kicks off. This is where territory, sovereignty, and human lives are all on the line. And believe me, the arguments are often just as fierce as any military fight. Okay, so get this. During the War of 1812 talks, the British came in with this huge demand, an independent indigenous buffer state smack in the middle of the American Midwest. It was a strategic move, right? Block U.S. expansion. But for the Americans, it was an absolute non-starter. They saw it as giving up their own sovereign territory and just flatly refused.
And you know what can really throw a wrench in the works? Alliances. I mean, they can complicate things like you wouldn't believe. During the Revolution talks in Paris, the American goal was simple. We want independence and we want land. But their allies, France and Spain, they were playing a totally different game. They wanted to get revenge on Britain and reclaim territory they'd lost. Creating a powerful new American nation that could one day be a rival? Yeah, that wasn't exactly part of their plan.
And all these complexities? Man, they can cause some incredible delays. The Korean War armistice talks, for example, just dragged on for a staggering 2 years. That's the longest in history.
Think about that. Over those 2 years, the opposing sides held 158 grueling, often hostile meetings, just to agree to pause the fighting. When you boil it all down, each of these negotiations really hinged on one fundamental make-or-break issue. For the Revolution, it was about the very existence of a new nation and its borders. For the War of 1812, it was the wild idea of creating an entirely new indigenous state. And in Korea, the talks stalled for months over the deeply emotional issue of prisoners of war. Specifically, should they be forced to go back home, or should they be allowed to choose their own fate? All right, so after all that back and forth, what was the final score? Once the ink is dry in the treaty, who actually comes out on top? Let's break down the scorecard for each conflict. With the Peace of Paris, there was no doubt about it. The United States was the undisputed winner. They got independence and a huge amount of territory. Great Britain clearly lost its prized colonies. But for the other European powers, well, it was a mixed bag. France got its revenge, sure, but it bankrupted itself doing it, a crisis that actually helped spark its own revolution. And while Spain got some land back, it failed to reclaim its main prize, Gibraltar.
The outcome of the War of 1812 is perfectly captured by this Latin phrase, status quo ante bellum. It literally means the situation as it was before the war. After years of fighting, the final treaty was basically just a complete reset.
As one person put it at the time, it was as if no war had been fought. Nothing has changed. Seriously, no territory changed hands, no major policies were altered. It was a draw, fought at a terrible cost. But for the young United States, you could argue that just surviving a second war with Britain really solidified its national identity for good.
And then you've got the Korean War, which is just a whole different story. It didn't end with a winner, a loser, or even a draw. It didn't really end at all. The fighting just stopped. It was paused with a military truce, not actually resolved with a political settlement. So this all brings us to the lasting legacy of these agreements. What are the echoes of these different endings tell us about the true definition of peace?
And listen, understanding this distinction is everything. An armistice is basically the generals agreeing to a ceasefire. A peace treaty is the politicians formally ending the war.
And because the Korean War only has an armistice, the two Koreas technically remain in a state of war to this very day, over 70 years later.
So what are the big takeaways here? Well, first, we've seen how the way a war ends shapes the future, sometimes for centuries. A decisive victory, like in the American Revolution, creates a new world power, while a mere pause, like in Korea, creates a permanent flashpoint. We've also seen that peace isn't just an event, it's forged in this brutal process where even your allies have competing agendas. And maybe most importantly, we've learned that winning is rarely simple. France won against Britain but crippled its own economy, while America fought to a draw in 1812 but ultimately won a stronger sense of itself.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought. When you look at the Korean Peninsula, where armies still face each other across a demilitarized zone, you have to ask, if a truce is never converted into a formal peace treaty, can we ever say the war is truly over?